everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar, Transitioning from the Bench to a Career in Science Policy. My name is Nicole Catanzari, and I'll be chairing and moderating this webinar. And in just a couple of minutes, we will introduce you to the rest of the panelists as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So on the agenda for today, first we will cover an introduction to science policy, discuss some skills for success. You'll hear from our panelists. They'll tell their stories and talk about the various career sectors that they are in, which include the federal government, a regulatory agency, policy consulting, and government relations. Then we will discuss some resources for you to use to transition into a career in science policy. And then we will have some time for Q&A. So again, my name is Nicole Catanzari. I'm chairing this webinar, and currently I am a neuroscience policy liaison in the DC Metro area chapter of SFN and a former early career policy ambassador with SFN. And our panelists, in order that they'll be presenting, Vijeth Iyengar is from HHS, Kimberly Maxfield is from the FDA, Amy Hein from Ripple Effect, and Adriana Bankston from the University of California. So what is science policy? First of all, we just want to give you a bit of a definition on what science policy actually is. It is concerned with the allocation of resources for the conduct of science toward the goal of best serving the public interest. Some topics include science funding, careers and workforce development, and translation of scientific discoveries into technological innovation. And some goals of science policy include promoting commercial product development, competitiveness, as well as economic growth and development. So when you hear about science policy, you might have heard that there is science for policy and also policy for science. So there's kind of two sides to science policy as a whole. Science for policy involves scientific findings used as the basis for the development of public policy, while policy for science involves government laws, regulations, and policies that affect the practice of science. We have a poll question for you just before we get into the panelist stories. What would you like to learn from this workshop? So just take a minute to let us know what you'd like to learn. Okay, let's give about 5 or 10 more seconds to put your answers into the poll. Okay, the poll is now closed. So it looks like we're interested in a variety of different things. We'll be covering many of those during the webinar today. Okay, and some essential skills for science policy that you might want to keep in mind as we hear the panelists' stories. Maybe think about whether you've started to develop these and think about how these kinds of skills apply into the kind of work that our panelists are doing. So some of these skills include acquiring a broad knowledge of science and its applications, the ability to learn about new issues quickly, the ability to communicate technical concepts to diverse audiences concisely and accurately. And if any of you are already involved in outreach through your graduate programs or postdocs, you might already have experience doing this. Consensus building and networking and relationship building. So our first panelist for today is Dr. Vijeth Iyengar. He is the Brain Health Lead and Technical Advisor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Aging at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So thank you, Vijeth, for joining us. If you want to just take a few minutes to tell us a bit about your transition story, your current position, and any advice you have for the attendees, as well as the most important skills that you use.
Thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. As was mentioned, my name is Vijay Thangar, and it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today on this webinar. My thanks to my fellow panelists in the Society for Neuroscience SFN support team, including Vlara and Amanda, for putting this together. Being trained as a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm very familiar with SFN and have fond memories somewhat of that mad dash and scramble to submit and prep abstracts and posters for annual meetings, and the sheer joy of being able to share one's work with the community. A brief bio was shared of each of the panelists, so instead of retelling you what's in it, I thought I'd spend a few minutes sharing my journey from academics and graduate school to a role in the US federal government that sits at the intersection of research, programmatic design, implementation and evaluation, and public policy. As mentioned, I'm trained as a cognitive neuroscientist and commenced graduate work in about 2010 in a lab that employed functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, to examine the neural mechanisms of episodic memory in humans across the lifespan. Really fascinating and invigorating work, and was surrounded by some smart, supportive, and capable colleagues and advisors throughout the process. I recall from day one of graduate school that I was dead set on an academic career, your typical tenure track position at an academic or research institution. But about 4 years into my graduate school, so I'm going to date myself, so about 2014, just after receiving my master's en route to a PhD, I began to realize that for me, there was an imbalance that didn't sit well with me of the time, what I call the time to impact ratio. That was also echoed by other peers across other labs. Specifically, one could spend many months and years on a project, and the outcome, i.e. a publication, could be appreciated by few, or if you're super lucky, by many. I was envisioning more of an impact that was not so many degrees removed from the end user or beneficiary of my research. In parallel, around that time, the US federal government was also pushing out exciting new initiatives such as the BRAIN Initiative, and beginning to infuse the principles of behavioral economics into the design of public policy. Exciting in it was the beginnings of how neuroscience and psychology would help and shape public policy for years to come. Now, careers in science policy or adjacent to science policy, as described by Nicole, were discussions of non-tenure track paths. And they weren't so common in terms of those discussions just even a couple of years ago. I'm talking 2013 and 2014, but have now become normalized, which is great to see. While in graduate school during that time, I decided to change paths and start to re-engineer my resume to make it more appealing to a career in public policy, government, and this intersection of science, policy, and programmatic design. After dozens, if not hundreds of informational interviews, coffee chats, calls, it became clear that there were two paths for me to pursue this new passion. One was consulting, and the other was applying to fellowships that would serve as pathways for me to enter federal government. I applied on a whim, some would say, to the Presidential Management Fellowship. It's a 2-year fellowship operated by the US Office of Personnel Management, OPM, and was selected through an exhaustive screening process to be a PMF fellow to the US Administration for Community Living, an operating division of the US Department of Health and Human Services. I started this fellowship in September of 2016, or a little about 5 years ago or so. The agency's mission, of which I'm involved with now, is to maximize the independence, well-being, and health of older adults, people with disabilities across the lifespan, and their families and caregivers. Additionally, the agency is a critical component of the US federal government's efforts to provide services and supports to older adults, a population group that is going to grow in the coming years and decades to come, people with disabilities and their families and caregivers. Briefly, my role at the agency falls under 3 broad buckets. One, as a program officer for the agency's Alzheimer's disease programs initiative, I provide management oversight and technical guidance to dozens of grantees nationwide that are implementing evidence-based, scientifically grounded interventions for family caregivers and persons with dementia. Anything from reducing caregiver stress and burden to applying the latest science to improving the care for persons with dementia fall under the purview of this grant program. As the agency's brain health lead, I leverage a lot of the technical skills and expertise acquired through graduate school, and to follow the latest advances in our scientific understanding of the modifiable risk factors in maintaining one's brain health, to curate and create educational related programmatic activities and content for beneficiaries of our agency's grant programs and other activities. A lot of this work is held in conjunction with other operating divisions within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the National Institutes on Aging, to name a few. And finally, as a technical advisor to the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Aging, I develop briefs, talking points, presentations, or web content to facilitate current work activities on topics of aging, brain health, and long-term care services, in addition to facilitating his engagement with the global efforts on aging, including representation from the United Nations and the World Health Organization. I listed on that slide here that Lyra's put up on the screen some of our goals of the agency that I've articulated, and some of the skills that I found particularly useful when carrying out the duties, roles, and responsibilities while at the agency. I don't know, perhaps we're running out of time for my portion of the remarks, but later in the webinar, happy to talk more about the fellowship, my pathway to government, and my role at the Department of Health and Human Services, or work done while on detail or secondment for extended periods of time at the World Health Organization or the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Thanks very much. I'll pass it on to Lyra. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijeth. Next up, we have Dr. Kimberly Maxfield. She is a policy lead in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology at the Food and Drug Administration.
Great, thanks, Nicole, for the introduction, and thanks for the organizers and SFN for inviting me to share my story. Hopefully it will be helpful for some of you out there. So as Nicole mentioned, my name is Kimberly Maxfield. I am currently a policy lead at the FDA. And I'll spend a few minutes talking a little bit about how I landed as a policy lead at the FDA. I did not know this job existed when I was in graduate school. So this is something that, was very much a real-time decision-making process for me. However, I think unlike some of my other colleagues in my doctorate work, my transition probably started before I went back to get my PhD. I always knew I was interested in public health and policy related activities, and spent quite a bit of time before applying to go back to school doing informational interviews to decide what kind of background I needed to be a successful policymaker in public health. And the sort of consistent advice I got at the time was having the technical expertise is extremely important to be an effective policymaker. So that is actually the reason why I went back and focused on technical expertise. But once I was in graduate school, I think I had a very similar experience to Vijeth, where after about a couple of years, I started saying, okay, great, I'm developing this expertise. How do I then translate this into policy? And at this point, which is roughly around the same time, the early teens, it's just nobody knew what I was talking about as far as science policy. It's very in the academic field. It's pretty specific to getting more funding when you say the word science policy, which is super duper important, but is a very small piece of the whole puzzle. So what I ended up doing is, I did some activities throughout graduate school, outreach, communication, but my actual jump was I applied to the Christine Mirzayan Technology Policy Fellowship. That's offered through the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. It's a 3-month fellowship that's offered, I believe, once a year. I think it was twice a year for a while. And so I moved from my graduate work to DC with this 3-month fellowship, and was able to, and in that fellowship, I worked in the Board of Healthcare Services, where my whole world expanded about what it meant to be someone in science policy, what it meant to have a technical background. And that's basically how I learned about regulatory science, met people at the FDA, and then was able to move over to the FDA. I started as a program manager and a regulatory scientist, and then moved over to policy lead about 2 years ago. But it was a wild ride. It was very exciting. But it was, each step I took was, into an unknown. It was, that sounds like a really nice story when you sort of look back and tell it, but I can assure you that in each step it was deciding what to do and it being excited about learning. It was a very exciting time. As far as what advice I would give to people who are thinking about this transition, just don't give up. There's no one right way to transition. No one has the same story as you'll even hear today. So, you'll find your way and your niche. Science policy is pretty tolerant of a broad backgrounds and perspectives, which is one of the reasons I actually enjoy being in science policy. So just don't get discouraged. There is a need out there. And then going to my current job. So as a policy lead, I work at the FDA, and I think probably most people are at least somewhat familiar that the FDA works on approving safe and effective use of medical products. I specifically work on drugs, and I'm in the Office of Clinical Pharmacology. And basically clinical pharmacology is, in a nutshell, we work to optimize the dose and the dosing regimens for particular therapeutic products. So it's, is it better to do this dose or this dose? Is it better to do it every day or every other day? All those instructions you get from your doctor and your pharmacist are from clinical studies and research, figuring out how that drug affects the body and how that will then lead to or not lead to a clinical outcome. I work specifically with therapeutic proteins, so I do a lot with monoclonal antibodies, small peptides, and everything in between, anything from actual reviews themselves, so when sponsors submit applications, to developing guidelines and guidances, to stakeholder outreach, to writing papers, etc. But this is just one, I'm just one policy lead in this with this portfolio. There's 5 policy leads in my office, and we each have a unique portfolio. So there's another lead who looks at pediatric drug development, somebody who looks at the drug-drug interactions. So when you take more than one drug, making sure they don't interact with each other. If you have other comorbidities, like you're renally impaired or hepatically impaired, if there are gender differences or race differences, in a particular response, we look at all of that to come up with dosing recommendations. Next up, the sky is the limit. I look forward to continuing to work at the FDA long-term and cannot recommend it enough. And with that, I'll hand it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Kimberly. Our next panelist is Dr. Amy Hein. She is Senior Director of Strategic Staffing at Ripple Effect.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole, and thanks to SFN for the invitation and just the foresight for putting this panel together. If you want to even just go back a slide still, I'll stay on my picture and background there for the intro part. So my story is very similar to the ones that we've heard already today. And I think, as you look at sort of what options you have next, just wanted to highlight the fellowships and the importance of science policy fellowships. So I similarly wanted the higher level perspective. I did a PhD in neuroscience, went to all the SFN conferences and presentations, did the abstract submissions. and was in a postdoc and realized I wanted that higher level perspective. But I'll be honest, I also had practical reasons for thinking about next steps. I married into the military and realized very quickly that that was going to involve a lot of relocation, and it was unlikely to fit into an academic career or even, a federal government career, something that would, require you to be in a particular location. So started looking into what other options would be better suited to that and allow for some more flexibility. So I did 2 different fellowships. You've heard about a couple already, including the Merzyan fellowship with the National Academies of Science. That was the first one, and definitely kind of gave me the bug for science policy. I then, after going back to my postdoc for a little while, went into the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. So if you haven't heard of that, definitely look it up. It's a great opportunity where the National Academies one is a 3-month fellowship that really just kind of gives you a quick dose and throws you in. The AAAS one is a 1 or 2 year fellowship. There's a couple of different avenues to get into it through different professional societies as well as through AAAS directly, but you actually get placed usually with a federal agency supporting it directly. And that's a really valuable opportunity to get that, more in-depth and longer perspective of supporting the federal government. I was at NINDS supporting their Science and Policy and Planning Office. Loved a great opportunity and great networking relationships, but wanted to actually get back closer to the science. We keep talking about wanting the higher level perspective. I felt like that was too high and wanted to be closer to actually advising on science and back to sort of my technical roots. So the next 2 positions I had there supported DARPA and CDMRP. I made that jump into government contracting. And, we talk about science policy as having to do with funding and resources, right? Part of that is the oversight and management of federal programs and research programs. So I supported the government as a federal contractor on both of those, joining Ripple Effect for the second one. And the other piece just to point out here is both of those job opportunities I had through connections through the fellowships. So I got hired to support DARPA because of a connection I made through my Merzyan fellowship with an alumni from that program. And I heard about Ripple Effect through a connection with the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. So again, just sort of the power of the networks and partnerships that you form through the fellowship programs. I've been with Ripple Effect for 6 years now. After being a science officer for a year, moved over to more of the program management side of things, and have really enjoyed kind of working with scientists. A lot of what I do is talking to people and, whether it's the government or trying to hire new people, telling them about sort of opportunities that exist in the policy consulting sphere. And I really enjoy doing that. So next slide, in terms of the job goals for policy consulting and government contracting, they're very similar to the things you've already heard, right? So the second bullet there talks about some of the different support areas. It can be everything, right? So it can be strategic planning or program administration. We do meeting facilitation and program evaluation. It's really not specific to a particular content area. It depends on what your consulting subject matter expertise is. And I think, the sky is really the limit there, and will continue to, be a way to bring in new expertise to the science policy arena. But the difference is, the role in policy consulting is to really provide expert advice, deliverables or work products, whatever it might be, but just sort of general support services to, in the case of Ripple Effect, our federal, private, and nonprofit clients. So obviously the federal government is one of the biggest customers out there in terms of they have a lot of money in the policy world, but there are also opportunities to consult to private industry, to pharmaceutical companies, to nonprofits, to professional societies, and the like. So there's a couple of different avenues and they each have different feels and flavors. But the main focus and real driver is this focus on customer service, right? In this case, we are supporting the mission of the client that we're working with, right? So, HHS has a particular mission, NIH has a particular mission, whatever the agency or company is that you're working with, your role is to help support them. And of course, a big part of that is thinking about their needs and providing the support they need. I wanted to highlight a couple skills in particular. I think my colleagues have done a great job, and there's a lot of similarity across those. So communication is absolutely, I think, one that needs to be underscored, being able to talk about your own skills, your transferable skills as you're looking for jobs, but your research, your past projects, whatever it might be, those verbal communication skills as well as written communication skills are important, and one of the most important things I look for in hiring. Some different skills for the consulting world, I think, are some of these next bullets that I wanted to highlight. Entrepreneurship and partnership, I think, are two maybe not unique, but ones that are particularly focused in the consulting world, right? Sometimes people say, oh, I don't want to be in academia because I'm tired of writing grants and I don't want to have to be fighting for funding all the time. If that's the case, consulting might not be the best option for you, right? As a consultant, you're often, either independent, working for yourself as a small business, or with a small business, or you may be working with a large business. But in any of those cases, you still need to, get gigs, get jobs, get contracts, get clients to pay for your services. So a big part of it involves proposal writing or grant writing, or partnerships, right? Networking with those potential clients, people who are going to need your help, as well as potential partners, right? Like just people that you meet and you talk with. Oftentimes we may not have every skill that the client needs. And so we have to partner with another company, right? We might bring great skills in science policy or technical skills, but maybe we don't have some of the more IT skills or some more of the cyber skills or something else. And so partnerships and networking are a really important piece to that piece as well. Flexibility is a really key area, both in terms of a skill you need to have to be able to be flexible, to adapt to customers' demands. Things change all the time, and be able to be responsive to that. But there's also just the value of flexibility in consulting, right? I mentioned that I went into it partly because I knew I needed location flexibility. It provides that, but also I've been part-time twice in my career so far, right? I had different personal reasons that I wanted to work part-time, and that flexibility was afforded to me. So that's one of the benefits, I think, of consulting that is not always available in other career paths. And the last two bullets I have are about root cause analysis. I think that's something that we as scientists are often really good at. We have to figure out what's wrong with our experiment, what went wrong, or, what's the, what do we need to do to fix something? And that's often a very valuable skill in the consulting world, right? The government comes to you with a problem and says, hey, can you advise us here? Can you fix this? To be able to say, yes, I can help you fix that, but it's not what you think it is, right? There's something else going on, something underlying that. And how do I actually address that root issue? And then, of course, there's always conflict that comes up in any situation. But I think in science policy in particular, we're often brought in to help manage stakeholders or bring diverse parties together. So those are just a highlight of some of the particular skills I think that are important in the policy consulting world. And I think the job titles are probably very similar to ones that you've heard from others. Again, it's not that it's a different content area, it's policy analysts or program managers, whatever, kind of field it might be in, but rather just sort of who our clients are in that perspective we're taking. And then, I just wanted to point out the fellowships and internships. Those are a great way to get into science policy. At Ripple Effect, we have positions called future Ripplers. So we're always trying to sort of, again, to that networking piece, bring in people who are interested in the company and in those types of roles. So that's something that you can apply to, just to, kind of say you're interested. Maybe you're not looking for something now, but in the longer term you are, and help to build out that network. We also have something called a Science and Health Policy Consulting Consortium. We call it SHPC. So, if you're thinking about, I want to get into consulting, but I don't know where to start, or I don't know what resources are available to me. That's a group of people that we brought together to have sort of people who are like-minded, who are interested in that consulting world, to be able to share resources and lessons learned and other things, and to, make it known that, hey, we're interested or available if there's ever, partnerships or opportunities that come up. So please, take a look at both those if those are things that might be interesting to you. And back over to you, Nicole. Happy to take more questions and stuff at the end too.
Thank you, Amy. Our last panelist is Dr. Adriana Bankston. She is Principal Legislative Analyst at the University of California, working in federal government relations.
Thank you, Nicole. Great to be here. And as you see from the slide, I was previously to my position now, I was a fellow at the Society for Neuroscience. So it's really great to be here today talking to all of you. Thanks to SFN for this webinar. So my path in policy really started, and as you can see, still very tied to the academic space. I've really been interested for a while in thinking about how we can improve institutional policies for the next generation grad students who are going through it and different career paths. And like many other panelists you've heard, I was also interested in academic career for a while. I actually didn't start thinking about policy until my postdoc, when I, again, was sort of exploring this area of, in part, my own path out of academia, trying to figure out how to use my PhD to help improve society. What does that look like? And So a lot of my path to my current role is very exploratory, sort of trying different things, doing a lot of informational interviews, trying to understand what the different positions in policy were and what people are doing, what sort of that day-to-day look like. And then in academia, I was, as I said, sort of interested in the pipeline questions, still sort of using that as a thread to move forward. And over time, as I transitioned from academia, I volunteered with several nonprofits that were either working on sort of the academic system or looking to help students transition into policy careers. And again, that sort of bridge my two interests related to training and policy. And so that's a tip for you for volunteering, because that can go a long way in different experiences that you have and skills that you can gain along the way through different organizations and nonprofits. And then, so this transition, I would say, lasted probably about 2.5 years. And then I did my fellowship with SFN in 2019, similarly to a few other stories here. I moved cross country from California to DC for a 6 months fellowship, not really having a plan afterwards, but that's oftentimes how things work. You just have to take the opportunity, and really enjoyed my time there. This fellowship is in the advocacy and training department, so I really got to do a lot of everything that I enjoy, policy advocacy and training, and really learn how to how you actually advocate for research funding. How do you write policy documents? What does it mean to go to the Hill? We organized the Hill Day, which is part of the fellowship, and then I also got to help a little bit with the training portfolio. In the meantime, it was a difficult transition in that I was trying to network and meet people for the next step and then what the next job was going to be. Had a number of interviews, and then ended up in my current role here. So if you can go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about what that looks like. So in this position, essentially our role is we are the federal arm of the UC system, and we advocate for priorities of the system in DC, which comes with really exciting times and really challenging, partly because working for a system in itself is a little tricky, and trying to sort of advocate on behalf of a number of universities in DC. But at the same time, it's obviously one of the most prominent systems in the country, and it's very exciting to be here, especially now with the new administration and changes that are happening that affect our priorities. So this position is very much an advocacy role where we advocate for the system with Congress, the administration, and federal agencies. This means that it's a lot of meetings with different stakeholders, as was mentioned previously, sort of trying to push priorities of the system and see what that looks like in the community, who else is advocating for those things, how can we push for things together on the Hill, and so on. And then, as my title says, we do analyze legislation related to federal policy impacting university research. This is really variable. So that's one piece of advice, is that when you're sort of transitioning from the bench to policy, you're sort of going from being a specialist to a generalist. So you really need to be able to sort of do a lot of different things during your day and shift priorities. So there's a lot of issues that you might imagine the system advocates for in the research side, funding, as well as sort of the pipeline, and especially now what that looks like with the pandemic and sort of students staying in research and so on. So I do enjoy that part. And as we're sort of highlighting the research in the system, so a lot of my job is sort of liaising between researchers and policymakers, briefings at the Hill and other events to showcase the value of federal research funding by having faculty or students or postdocs talk about what they work on in the lab and sort of leverage that to advocate for more research funding. There's also a lot of writing, which is something I would also advise you to try and develop now. Drafting policy documents, priority documents, letters to the Hill, and so on. So there's always sort of the advocacy side, but also really learning how to write these documents does take some practice, does take a while, and sometimes it happens on the job. And then because we are a large system, we do work with obviously each campus as well. So part of our job is to answer questions and do research on things that campuses are interested in terms of grants or programs from federal agencies. So that's agency side of we do, go to NSF, meet with program directors on certain issues that our campuses have questions about. And then we also advocate not just for obviously research funding, but also the pipeline, trainees in the system. Obviously now there's a lot of research questions. And so we do intersect also obviously with other universities that have similar priorities, and also higher education associations like AAU and APLU and so on. So it's a really interesting role to be in, and especially at this time. So in terms of skills, I think these have already been covered. Writing is a big part of my job. Really learning how to translate your research for non-academic audiences goes a long way, whether you do it through, blogging or OPADs or so on. There's different ways to sort of build that. Teamwork and collaboration. I just put this here because there's a lot of collaboration. There are a lot of common projects across the different areas. And you really have to be able to work with people from different backgrounds, which is very helpful. And then responding to federal issues quickly. So things in DC do move quickly, which is part of the exciting part of the job, that you do have to be on your toes all the time and see what's going on and sort of respond to it. But it can also be challenging if you're the kind of person that likes to plan your day, and you may not always be able to do what you plan to do when you go in office. And as I mentioned already, prioritizing and pivoting between projects as you're, likely to be working on a lot of different things sort of during the day. And then job titles. So analyst, I think, is pretty common. And then sort of up the ladder, you would think about sort of director, assistant director. These are sort of common titles in federal relations. So thank you. Turn it back to Nicole.
Thank you, Adriana, and thank you to all of the panelists. So in our last couple of minutes for our last section, we're just going to go over a few resources. And then after that, there will be time for Q&A. So if you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to start queuing those up in the Q&A box. So why don't everyone just take a minute to fill out this poll question. What kinds of resources are you interested in? Okay, maybe take 5 or 10 more seconds to finish filling out your answers. All right, so it looks like quite a few of you are interested in information about fellowships and internships. That's something we can definitely discuss more during the Q&A. Also, quite a few people interested in other informal and formal training opportunities, and then networking and writing and publishing opportunities sound like they're of importance as well. So thank you to everyone who participated in the poll. So to get started on this, some resources and opportunities that you can start considering and getting involved in if you're interested in transitioning to science policy. First of all, include involvement in societies and organizations. SFN is a big one. The DC metro area chapter of SFN. Adriana, the last panelist you heard from, and I co-chair the Neuro Policy Committee. So if you're interested in attending more events like this, feel free to join the chapter. Currently, all of our events are virtual, and we may continue to do some virtual opportunities in the future. So that is a good way to keep learning more. AAAS, many panelists have mentioned the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. AAAS also has a CASE workshop, CASE workshop each year that you can apply to attend. JSPG, that's the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. That is a great journal for early career researchers to get involved with and practice submitting policy memos and writing policy briefs. NSPN is another organization that you might like to check out. And then your university might have a science policy group. Many of them do. Another way to get involved involves attending advocacy meetings and Hill Days. So SFN has an annual Hill Day each year, which many of you might already know about. If you apply for SFN's Early Career Policy Ambassador program, that will give you an opportunity to attend one of those Hill Days. And the Rally for Medical Research holds a Hill Day every year as well. So those are two big ones that you might be interested in checking out. And attending these Hill Days basically involves meeting with your legislators, the ones that represent your district, and speaking about advancements in neuroscience and the importance of strong funding for NIH, NSF, the VA. So that's a great opportunity. And then volunteer and leadership opportunities. If you're currently a grad student, you can do things like getting involved in your university senate, graduate student government, getting involved in any kind of outreach opportunities within your department or program. Serving on those committees and organizations is just a great way to gain that communication and leadership experience that will be valuable to you in science policy. And then finally, the fellowships and internships. You can find these in nonprofit organizations. There are congressional ones, as well as federal and state government. So now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. So again, if you would like to ask a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A box. And we already have a number of them queued up. So panelists, if you would like to prepare, we will start going through the Q&A. So our first question is from Sydney. She says, "Hi Nicole, my name is Sydney Woods and I'm an incoming neuroscience PhD student at GW in the fall. I'm highly interested in getting involved in science policy however I can and would love any tips or thoughts on getting involved in the DC metro area. Thank you." So thanks for your question, Sydney. The first thing that I would recommend, as mentioned on the previous slide, would be to join the DC chapter of SFN. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. And then I would also recommend applying for SFN's Early Career Policy Ambassador program. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I'd be happy to talk to you. You can feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn and we can talk more. And big congratulations on starting your PhD. So next question we have is from Sabina, and she asks about average salary. So looks like this one was directed to Vijeth, but maybe we can direct this to everyone. Would everyone be able to maybe tell us what kind of starting salary range people can anticipate in your various kinds of sectors and positions?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think there's always a hesitation on talking about salary. It's an important thing to talk about, but I will say, what I will say is that in the US federal government, there is something called the general schedule, so GS, and it's a combination of your years of work experience, your expertise, and at what level you're coming at. So if one were to come into the federal government with a PhD in hand, you're likely to have a higher GS level, which is accompanied by a higher salary than if you were to come in with, say, a master's or a bachelor's. So I think those are publicly available, the GS levels and the associated salary for a particular position, but it's a unique combination of both years of experience, expertise, and your fit with the job. One thing that I would encourage you to do is to go to, just to get an idea of a ballpark as to particular positions, is to enter in, some of the slides mention job titles. At the agency that I work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, there's an aging service program specialist. That's one's position series and position title. You can enter that into USA Jobs and get a picture as to what the range of salaries would be depending on the GS level. But it's not something where it really depends on what level you're coming into the government. The other think tanks, non-governmental organizations might have different ranges, but it's really incumbent on both experience, years, and how you fit into the job. It's a diplomatic way of answering that question, but hopefully it gives you enough resources to then be able to get a range in mind. Thanks.
I can add a thought too, which I agree with all of those pieces. And I would say even in the contracting and consulting world, that's a good place to start. We often look at the, schedules and scales and look to say like, okay, if you have a PhD and a few years experience, maybe we're talking a GS-12, something like that. And that might help give you some sort of ballparks. Although, you have to keep in mind, if you're making a career transition, if you don't have much experience and you're, kind of trying to leverage those transferable skills, it might be, lateral transfer, or, you might be willing to take a lower salary to kind of get that foot in the door type of thing. So, don't be afraid to do that. And, salary is, of course, a really important piece, but I think one of the things I've learned over the years is often not the most important. Really get to know sort of the culture of the place you're going to go work for, and does it match what you're looking for? How does it set you up on a longer career path or trajectory? And is that what you want to be on? Is flexibility important to you? Or, what, just kind of doing that internal searching of what's really important to you and looking at sort of the full picture of the position to see if it aligns with the other pieces as well.
All right.
This
Go
is
ahead,
Kimberly. Oh yeah, I was just going to add one thing is salary negotiation still applies in the government if you're looking at the GS scale. It actually almost is more important because the GS scale, so if anyone doesn't know what we're talking about, just Google GS scale OPM and it'll come up. Is the GS scale actually is on like a very, it's like you move up a step at like very regular predetermined intervals. So the slope is almost always the same. So where you start is going to determine your y-intercept, if that makes sense. So like where you start is really important in the government, because because then once you're in, the slope is pretty similar. I mean, occasionally you'll get, not occasionally, but like there are opportunities for promotions, but it's, as everybody probably has heard, at least in some capacity, HR in the government is notoriously horrible, and that is correct. I can confirm that. But just that's something that you can negotiate in the government too, and I would encourage everyone to do so for that reason.
That's very good advice. Thank you, everyone. So Kimberly, while we have you on, the next question is actually for you. Do you read research or participate in the experiments to come up with the ideal dosages? It sounds like they're wondering if you are participating any kind of maybe bench research or really digging into the articles, or if your position is not really involved in that kind of stuff anymore.
Yeah, I'm not at the bench at all. So a lot of what FDA does is pharmaceutical companies will come in during their development. So this is actually a part of FDA that I think is not discussed a lot externally because it's all proprietary. So the details cannot be discussed. But the most impact the FDA has is actually during the drug development, when the sponsor is coming in, we call them sponsors, the company is coming in and asking for how to set up their program at various stages. So at phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, preclinical, non-clinical, what's their best dose. So from a clin pharm perspective, we actually have the most impact at the end of phase 2, which is basically where the company is trying to figure out what population the drug is going to work in. And so that's when they're trying different regimens, different dosing levels, they're trying all that. And they basically will submit a meeting package to us, and we will have an open and honest discussion, scientifically based discussion about what we think the best path forward is with the best risk benefit profile. And yeah, I'm not at the bench at all. It's all reading submissions from companies and literature and talking to stakeholders. FDA does fund its own research. It's obvious the portfolio is nowhere near as big as the NIH, but when there are regulatory questions that need to be answered, it's like something, for example, would be this is a little in the weeds, but something like if you have a auto injector for some subcutaneous delivery of any, people want to do it in their shoulder or they want to do it in their thigh, does that change the exposure to the patient or depending on the site? That's the type of research FDA will do. And there's, I work with the group in my office who actually does the bench work to do that research, but I do not do it.
Thank you, Kimberly. We have a few questions that are related to academic research and tenure track professors transitioning to science policy. I'm thinking maybe we can combine a few of these. So do any of you have advice for maybe transitioning from an academic research position, or maybe while staying in that position, getting involved in science policy things that might, entail something like conflict of interest, or your employer, your institution maybe won't want you to take time away from your research and institution duties to do these kinds of things. And this might also go along with maybe transitioning mid-career, if we can kind of combine those together. Any advice?
I can answer to be part of it with the upfront knowledge that I was not an academic tenure track professor, but I have hired many into different kinds of roles. And, again, I think it depends a little bit on what you are looking for in science policy. If you think about it broadly, there's many different kinds of roles, as you've heard about, a number today already. But so we talked about some of the different fellowships and, getting involved in different, professional societies or other things. If those aren't options, those hopefully you already know about. But even, I think part of it is just figuring out how to talk about your roles and your skills that you're already doing in tenure track professors, right? You may be serving on different committees, right? Well, when you're in a committee, you may have stakeholder engagement and coordination and other pieces that you're already doing, right? Or you're mentoring or doing classes, right? Like there's communication skills that are part of your teaching and other duties that you have as part of your role already. Or maybe you have opportunities within the, job duties of your current title to even, lead up some, sort of like work group, like I know you had like journal club groups or other things, right? All of those things are kind of, additional, not part of like the bench part of the scientific world that I think allow you to, you have to think of how to write it on your resume, right? And talk about it in the interview, but allow you to talk about some of those other kinds of skills, right? Working on strategic planning. Maybe there's something going on in your institution or your, division that you can talk about related to that. So there may be opportunities like those, and it's a matter of keeping your eye out for those and figuring out how to talk about it, right? How to talk about those transferable skills and experiences.
Yeah, I would also say writing is important, even if you're mid-career. I think you want to be identified as a thought leader in a particular science policy issue space. And I think a lot of, this goes back to the question that's sent to Kim, that was directed to Kim in terms of you're used to the bench, you're used to driving your own research program, and now you come to the government, in the case of my example, and you're away from the bench, but still have that itch for that bench work or to get more intimately involved in the science. There's several ways in my role, to sort of scratch that itch. I try to write as much as possible, right? Pending clearance and review and that approval process for my particular agency on issues of importance in the aging, long-term care, or even neuroscience informed public policy debate. So, if you're mid-career, you already have all that expertise. I think it's a matter of getting your name out there, not just from just the academic side, but also the science policy on a particular policy debate, taking one side or the other, and then articulating why one particular policy area is of importance. And oftentimes, if it's in the right venue, a lot of folks, both policymakers on the Hill and folks in government, will read those articles and will reach out to you. And you'll be able to have a relationship from that article, from that thought leadership you put into a public space. So, one thing for that particular question, I would just continue to write. I mean, now there's all sorts of venues, nature aging, and coming from the aging space, where they have a policy and perspectives section or type of article. Even Neuron has a policy and perspective or neuro views, where if it gets enough traction within government, then you can build some sort of relationship there. I'll just really close very quickly. I know NSF, DARPA, other agencies have folks that are faculty at research institutions serve as program officers or managers for an extended period of time. Perhaps they take a sabbatical from the university, but that's another way to get sort of in the system, so to speak, and get your name out there.
Thank
So
you,
I can
Amy and
add-
Beth.
Sorry, can add to that. If you're, Jeff sort of covered what I was planning to say, but if you're early career, again, putting a plug for volunteering with nonprofits and societies, because it can really help you build connections and also the different skills that you need and deliverables and things that, you know, if you want to show that you've written policy, there's different ways to engage in doing that as well. But I can understand, you know, if you're sort of early and trying to do things, maybe your advisor wants you to be in the lab all the time and, you know, you're dealing with that. I do think that there are ways to do that. You know, on the weekends, you might be able to actually involve your advisor in some of the things. So that's one thing that I actually did. I organized an event and it was on my research and my advisor attended and still got, you know, the professional development out of that. And he was also happy with that. And then on the other side, I think is this comes up a lot recently, the sort of mid-late career options. I will say that I think, as you've probably seen, a lot of these fellowships are early career, very limited to a certain number of years post PhD to apply. AAAS, I believe, is more open, but also as some of the questions in the chats, there are other ways to transition, I think, and that if you gain enough experience and make the right connections, there are ways to transition that you may not necessarily need a fellowship.
Thank you, Adriana. Amy, here's an interesting one for you. Could you speak a bit about the difference between policy consulting and management consulting?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I'm not 100% sure what they were meaning. Again, I think policy, I think of it very broadly. So I think of them as kind of overlapping Venn diagrams. There are parts that are different, but I think a lot of what we do in what we call science policy involves management consulting aspects. And I think the management consulting side of things, it's science policy if it relates to the science policy pieces. So I think they're very related, and it just kind of matters whether or not you're pulling in that scientific expertise, understanding, and influence into the consulting that you're doing.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question about opportunities inside and out of DC. I think we've discussed a number of them within DC. Is anyone able to speak to some opportunities and types of science policy positions outside of the DC metro area? I'm thinking about things like state government or different think tanks that might be across the country.
One thing I can add is, I think especially after COVID, there's a lot more push to remote work. So I think in the consulting world, that's definitely a much more possible thing. But even in some of the federal spaces, there's discussions at least about that now that didn't used to be going on. I mean, I'm actually in the middle of the process of moving to Huntsville, Alabama. I'm going to continue working at Ripple Effect and just be fully remote. We've been remote for the last 16 months or so now anyway. And we've hired many folks across the country. So I think private industry is, and in the government contracting and consulting world, looking to do that as there's real talent shortages, especially if you have a particular expertise. So that might be one possibility that you'd have. Adriana, you might know more. There's, certainly through academic institutions going to be, different policy related opportunities across the country. There are some think tanks. I know I used to follow RAND is out. They have some office space in California. So, again, depending on where you are, there definitely are possibilities. It's just a matter of finding that network and to learn the things that exist there.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think there's a lot more state fellowships. So obviously there are not a lot of them, but I can see this becoming a trend to where different states are developing more of them. And I think state governments are also, I think it's a different type of impact, but it may be able to make a larger impact sometimes that way. And I think the things that exist in DC, some of these things I think exist elsewhere as well. So as you mentioned, think tanks, universities, there's, depending on the kind of policy that you want to do, there's probably some sort of setting for that. There may not be, government agencies and societies. I think most of those are in DC, but other sorts of settings that you might want to do policy in, you can look at those in your state.
Thank you, Adriana.
I'll also
So-
say that government has many regional offices across the US government has many regional offices across the country. So that's another opportunity.
Yeah, thank you, Vijeth. So we got a number of questions and didn't get to all of them, but if you still have questions, feel free to follow up with us. Here is all of our contact information. If you just want to screenshot this or take a picture with your phone to jot these down. I will say if you do send any of us a connection request on LinkedIn, if you could just add a message with it and say, you attended this webinar and are interested in learning more, that would be helpful so we know who you are. And then regarding the DC metro area chapter of SFN that I mentioned, here is the link to that if you would like to join. It is free. And if you'd like to follow on Twitter and Instagram, here is our handle, here is our Facebook. And there are a couple of Twitter handles for Vijeth and Adriana here as well. So thank you again to everyone for attending. I hope that this was helpful for your career advancement and enjoy the rest of the day.